when you have recordings, it's like a disembodied voice. You don't just anybody, it's like a little weird. So I think if we can have his face on there, like
it's going to block some of my content. But that's okay. That's okay.
I just
If you want that, that's fine.
That should work.
Okay. So in case you didn't get up at 2:30 on Thursday morning to see the lunar eclipse, I put a picture up.
You did.
Because I did get up to do it. So. Anyway, so today I thought we'd take a look at this odd theme, choosing religious leaders in 4 different churches. And what triggered this in my head was the fact that we're about to choose a new leader at World Conference coming up, and it's going to be a historic, momentous choice, assuming we vote in favor of her. But also Pope Francis is in very poor health, and so the Catholic Church is probably looking at leadership change sometime relatively soon. He's rallied a little bit, so he's doing better now. But and there are some issues with church leadership and orthodoxy right now. And so it seemed like it was a time maybe we could talk about this. Most of it's going to be our church, to be honest with you. But I thought we'd take a look at this. So we'll see how this goes. I'm going to start off just by doing a few, things that you all know already. Structure of Christianity. I just want to make sure it's all clear what we're talking about here. Christianity is the most numerous religion in the world by a significant margin. About 30% of all people in the world are Christians. That comes out to be, as you can see, about 2.5 billion people. 68% of all the countries in the world have a majority of Christians. That's 157 countries out of 232. And it's also, Christianity is one of the most diverse religions in the world. Diversity in terms of content and beliefs and so forth. So we are really high on that list in terms of diversity. And so the main diversity is this: 99.5% of all Christians belong to one of these 3 groups. So we have Roman Catholic, about 55% of all Christians. Protestant, about 34% of Christians, and Eastern Orthodox are about 10%. Actually, technically, us are in the other 0.5% because restoration is not considered part of this, although the reality is our church, not the Mormon church, but our church is so close to being a Protestant church that we really are a Protestant church. but the Mormons are not, so.
We're also a rounding error.
We're a rounding error. That's what we are. Aren't we proud? We're a rounding error. Excuse me. So, to remind you of the split between the Orthodox and Catholic Church, all the church was only a Catholic church for the first 1,000 years of Christianity. Catholic is not a religious term. It is a general, ordinary English word, which means universal in extent, involving all, interest to all. In other words, it was all they were saying is we were the Catholic Church because we were the only church, and it was the whole world was us. We were universal. And after about 700 AD, there were the 2 main centers, Rome and Constantinople. This had to do with the split of the Roman Empire between the East and the West, and there's all kinds of other things we don't need to get into, but these were the dominant places of Christianity at that point. They were developing different theologies, and a little after 1000 AD, the 2 bishops in charge of each of these churches excommunicated each other, which effectively split the church into Roman Catholic and Orthodox. Okay, so that's how the Roman Catholic and Orthodox came. So technically, when you say Catholic, you should say Roman Catholic, but that's okay. I don't do that often myself, but that's technically what you should do. So the church that stayed with the Bishop of Rome bishops were in charge of churches. So the Bishop of Rome became the Roman Catholic, and the people that stayed loyal to the Bishop of Constantinople became Orthodox. Okay, and then 500 years later, as you all know, some people got fussy about some of the things going on in the Roman Catholic Church, and so they started protesting some of the things in the Roman Catholic Church, and they developed followers, and we ended up with the Protestant churches that from 1500 on is when that all happened. Yeah, yeah,
Back to the other slide.
yes.
Was the split primarily geographic?
There was also theological.
Yeah,
But-
but I understand that.
Yeah.
Like, were the followers pretty much
Oh, yeah, oh.
geographically centered?
Actually, this is a really good question, and it's exactly right, yeah. That's why Eastern Orthodox is considered Eastern Orthodox, because most of the followers are in this part of the world, as we'll talk later. And then the Roman Catholic is mostly over here, so.
But then when they were talking about Eastern Orthodox, it's like Roman, like the Roman Catholicism, like this is kind of like north, and north.
In fact, look at this map.
All right.
So, and I'll give you your cash for asking that question later, so. But you can see on, unfortunately, it's not showing colors as well as it does when you look at it on your own computer screen, but the yellow is all the Orthodox. And what I've done here is I put in the linguistic family that goes with each of these. So this is a Slavic linguistic area. This is a Romance language linguistic area. So Romanian is a Romance language. It's not a Slavic language. And then we have Greek down here and so forth. So, you know, that Catholics are the orange, and you have Romance languages here, which are mostly Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and French. And then you have Slavic Catholics up here in Poland. You have Baltic Catholics, which are up here in Lithuania, and then German Catholics down here. And I wanted to point that out because we're going to make a point later on that the Catholic Church has started diversifying who gets to be Pope. And so recently we've had a Polish Pope, a German Pope, and then a Pope that's not even on the map. So, yeah.
Is Ireland?
Ireland's Gaelic Catholic. That's the G is Gaelic. Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, Protestant is all the purple, and you have Germanic languages. English is a Germanic language. German is, of course. All these Scandinavian languages are that. But this is Uralic. Finland does not speak a Germanic language, and so technically is not Scandinavia. And Estonia and Latvia are also Uralic in languages, or that's Baltic. This is Uralic. So Uralic means Ural Mountains. That came, people from over here came this way. That's how that happened. But after the 30 Years' War, this became the religious geography of Europe. It hasn't changed 1% since then. So let's look at Islam. How in Islam are leaders selected? And that's going to be our general overall theme here. 1.9 billion Muslims in the world, making it the second largest religion by a long margin. Hinduism is a third, and it's got about 1 billion. So it's like twice as many as Hindus. So 23% of the world population are Muslim. 21 countries, 49 countries have a majority of population are Muslim. As you undoubtedly know, there are two major divisions of Islam. Sunni make up 85-90% of all Muslims. That's about 1.65 billion people. That makes them the largest religious denomination in the world. There are more Sunni Muslims than there are Roman Catholics. So they dominate Islam everywhere except in the areas we talk about down here with Shia. So Shia are the followers we call Shiites. They make up about 10 to 12% of all Muslims. It's about 200 million people. Countries that are a majority of Shia are Iran, Iraq, and Azerbaijan. Yemen is close to a majority, but not quite, about 45%. And there's significant Shiite groups in a handful of other Muslim countries. But only 3 countries are a majority of Shia. This is an important distinction to make in Islam. These 2 groups don't get along particularly well. There's an unfortunate tendency in the United States to think that all Muslims are alike. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Even within Sunni, they're not all alike. Even within Shia, they're not all alike. But they're certainly not alike this way. This is sort of like the Catholic-Protestant split. Nobody would say Catholics and Protestants are all alike, and nobody should say Sunnis and Shiites are all alike. They don't get along particularly well. And one of the flashpoints in the Middle East is the fact that Iran and Saudi Arabia hate each other so much. And Saudi Arabia is the dominant Sunni country in the world, and Iran is the dominant Shiite country in the world. And they don't get along at all. So that's something to watch there. Okay, so Muhammad was the founder of Islam. He died in 632 AD. He was a charismatic and dynamic leader who organized a missionary outreach which brought in thousands and thousands and thousands of followers. So he developed the theology and the geographic expansion of Islam. And so he was all that. He was a quite dynamic person. And often what happens when you have a religious group that is founded by a dynamic leader like that, when they die, there's a fuss about who gets to be the leader after that. And that's what happened with Islam. Sunnis, this is when Sunnis and Shias split, was after Muhammad's death. And they split over the issue of succession, who was going to be in charge. So Sunnis believe that Muhammad left no obvious designation for a new leader. He didn't appoint somebody. And a group of his close companions chose this guy, Abu Bakr, who's Muhammad's close companion, advisor, and his father-in-law, to be the new head. Okay. Shiites believe that Muhammad designated a leader and said, this is the guy. Ali ibn Abi Talib, usually simply called Ali, and is a relative who was a relative of Muhammad, his cousin, and also his son-in-law. So he chose from within his family. This is an important point to make. He chose within the family, and Shiites have always believed it should be a family member of Muhammad should be in charge. Okay? And they split over this issue, and since then they have developed differences in political, judicial, and theological areas. But both sides pretty much have similar beliefs in terms of the basic principles of Islam, which are called the 5 pillars. Both accept the authority of the Quran, which is the scriptures of Islam, and so forth. But there are differences here. And one difference is in leadership structure. Okay. Sunni began with strong leaders called the caliphates. A caliph was the head of the thing. The caliphate is the area he ruled over. But they've evolved today so there's really no formal hierarchy. There's no one Sunni you can point to and say, that guy's in charge. That's just not the way they roll. Leaders are informal, and they gain influence by being study and devotion and becoming great experts in Islamic legal theory or theology. And that's how they rise to the top, and they're acknowledged as being the guy in charge of this particular area, this particular group, something like that. But there's no one Sunni guy who's in charge of all Sunnis. Okay. Leaders in Shia are called imams, usually. And the Shiites believe these are chosen by Allah, who's God, of course. Allah is just the Arabic word for God. And we should remind you that they worship the same God we worship. They just call him Allah. And so they think that their leaders are divinely appointed through prophetic insight and are designated by the previous imam, who is the head guy. So through prophetic insight of the imam, they have a successor. Okay, so just a little bit about Islam, and I wanted to do that too before we get to our church. Yes, as far as I know, that's true. They don't talk about caliphs so much, although I think there's some real conservative Sunnis that say we should go back to the caliph system and have caliphates and all that kind of stuff. I think the Taliban started doing that, and so did ISIS started doing that. They started developing a caliphate because they thought, oh, cool, we did that 1,500 years ago. We should do it now. That's how super conservative people think. So
Rich,
yeah.
how does that mean that, like, how does progress mean theologically, or does it?
Oh, I think what happens here in the Sunnis, especially people who study Islamic law or Islamic theology, just develop ideas, and if they're acceptable to the masses, then progress happens. It changes. You probably are well aware that there's a unique form of Sunni in Saudi Arabia called Wahhabism, and it came about because of a guy named Wahhab, who was the guy in charge of Saudi Arabia, and he developed his own kind of theological approach to Sunniism, which people accepted, and now it's one of the forces which is driving Sunni theology. So he just kind of developed that. In Shia, it's more divinely thing. The imams develop what they say are divine inspiration from Allah. So I thought we'd mention this, though. There's a widely reported and widely believed prophecy of Muhammad, which predicts there will be 12 successors as leader after him. It's accepted by both Sunnis and Shiites, but they have a difference in interpretation, of course, because they can't agree on much of anything in terms of succession. Sunni says, excuse me, I'm still getting over my cold, which kept me from coming last week, and so hopefully I won't cough too much. Sunnis say there have been a lot of rulers since Muhammad, and the Sunnis have identified 12 of those with the designated successors of Muhammad, like to be special, rulers. The Shia describes 10 imams who follow Muhammad, which are designated by prophetic power, and they think of these as being extraordinary people who are exemplary humans who rule with justice and follow Islamic law and the Quran. They're free from error, therefore infallible. Okay, so these are the infallible ones in Shia. And the interesting part of all this is this guy, Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Mahdi, who is the last of the imams, or last of these 12 successors. And both Sunni and Shiite accept that. They say, yeah, Mahdi is that person. And he's a popular concept amongst all Muslims, but he's more important in Shia than he is in Sunni. So Shia, he's referred to as Imam Mahdi. He's a descendant of Muhammad, which all the imams were, according to Shia. Believed to be born about here at 873 AD. He was an infant son of the previous imam who was hidden because there was fuss going on. They were afraid the baby was going to be harmed and all that kind of stuff. So they hid the baby. And Shia believed that he's still alive today. Okay, which should make him, you can do the math, that makes him, 1,300 years old or something like that, 1,250 years old. He's still alive today and is still hidden. So nobody knows who he is or where he is or what he's doing. And he will be revealed in the end times. Islam has a very robust apocalyptic end time theology, which is remarkably similar to Christianity's. That's where they got it from, mostly, was from Christianity. Before the day of judgment, and he will rule, he will rid the world of evil. And they believe that his tenure as imam will be coinciding with the second coming of Jesus. And the two together, Mahdi and Jesus, are going to oppose the false Messiah or the Antichrist, which is part of the stuff that goes, going on in Revelations. Jesus is considered the Messiah in Islam, and is thought to descend to a spot east of Damascus in Syria. East of Damascus puts him out in the desert of Syria. Okay, so he's an important guy in the end times theology. And so, there are all kinds of Shiites who are saying, just like there's all kinds of Christians saying, oh, the end times are coming, and they're about here, and Mahdi is going to be revealed, and look at the signs of the times, and they have that kind of stuff going on in Islam as well. Sunnis believe a lot of the same as Shia all about Mahdi, although they say he isn't alive. He's going to be born and revealed at the end times. So I just thought I'd mention that because he's like the ultimate ruler of Islam, and is going to be, and is kind of thought of as the one who's going to unite all of Islam at the end times to fight against the false Messiah with Jesus together side by side, and they're going to do that. So Jesus is a very big deal in Islam. He's all through the Quran. A lot of the miracles, his virgin birth, all of that is in there. So he's a big deal. Okay, so that's Islam. Any questions, comments before we go on to the good guys, which is our church? And I'm going to spend some time with this because of the importance of World Conference this year, I think. And there's some, you all know how we choose our leaders. I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know. Through prophetic revelation, somebody is appointed to be the prophet, seer, and revelator of the church, and then the World Conference votes whether to accept or not accept that person. And this is the way it's been pretty much since Joseph Smith Jr., so throughout our entire history. So, of course, that means the current prophet, if it all works the way it's supposed to, the current prophet then has a revelation which identifies the follower, the successor, and then has to be approved by World Conference. So that concept of common consent is important, yes.
So actually, the council as well, and like the church leaders of council came together
This time.
Now we're going to get to the exceptions in a minute, so don't because this is not worked this way almost half the time. So we're going to get to the exceptions in a minute. That's why I'm going to walk through all the prophets, and we'll see how that worked. Okay, so this is the way the original Revelation said it was going to work. Okay, we'll go through all those. You're going to get so much church history coming up here. So the common consent is important, as you know. This is important in our church, and it's legitimately important. We don't just pay lip service to this. We really do believe this. And so a prophet could be rejected by World Conference. And if a prophet is rejected, then they're gone, and they have to choose another one, It's not like they can mount an insurrection and say, follow me, boys. That's not going to happen. They're gone. So that's never been done. They've never rejected a prophet. But I thought we'd talk about Frederick M. Smith for a moment in the 1920s, who ran to a buzzsaw of opposition in the 1920s at World Conference, and things got dicey there. I thought we should spend a moment with that. So let's take a look at this. The core of the dispute over Frederick Smith dealt with the wielding of authority and reached its peak during the 1924 and 1925 conferences. This is at a time when they were doing conferences twice a year. There was a spring and a fall conference. So there were lots of conferences in there. So, and Smith believed that the president of the church himself had supreme directional control. That's the words he used, which are a terribly unfortunate combination of words to use in a church that has common consent. He presented a revelation which gave the prophet supreme directional control, and that meant that he had direct control over every aspect of church government, including finances. And if you know anything about our church history, the bishopric have always been prickly about that issue. And they have never liked the idea that somebody was going to take away their authority over finances. So, you know what hit the fan at this point. But he felt that the presidential authority was greater than the Council of Apostles, the bishopric, or the World Conference. So basically, he was trying to set up an authoritarian structure to the church. And the reason why he wanted to do that is because he believed strongly in the establishment of a literal Zion, and he was frustrated by the pace and by how slow it was going, and he wanted to just be able to bark orders, basically, and have stuff get done. A lot of people opposed this, and the conflict was serious enough that Smith finally said, okay, I quit. He submitted his resignation as prophet to the World Conference. The World Conference stewed about that for a while and realized they didn't want him to quit, so they rejected his resignation, but the entire presiding bishopric resigned. 2 apostles resigned. One of those founded a schism church, which lasted about 10 years. And hundreds, at least hundreds, maybe even thousands of members left the church over this. So it was a pretty dicey kind of thing. And it wasn't until 1931 that the bishopric regained control over finances, which they were able to do. So the reason for bringing this up is because at this point, what would have happened if they had accepted his resignation? Because there was no successor designated. Would they have allowed him the authority to appoint a successor if he was bounced from the church, in a sense, Fortunately, we didn't have to do that, but that was the issue. I think it might be. And a lot of people kind of freaked out thinking, oh, geez, we don't want to go through all this, So I'm not sure exactly what, because I was only a boy at this time. Just kidding. But in the 1920s, Judy, you were not. Yes, they did. They passed the what you call it, the revelation. It was a tough time in the church, and what actually kind of saved the church at that point was the Depression, because the Depression gave us a common enemy to hate, financial hardship, and we all pooled together. We all came together and said, okay, which is why the bishopric got the finances returned to him in 1931. So. You can have it back. I don't want to mess with the money now because it's a mess. So I kind of think that's how some of that happened. So the general outline of choosing leaders in Community of Christ is similar to that of Islam. And I thought I'd point out the similarities here, which is kind of interesting. Like Islam with Muhammad, the Restoration had a dominant, charismatic leader, Joseph Smith Jr., who was the founder of the movement and developed the doctrine, right? In both cases, the death of the leader caused a lot of confusion about who was going to be in charge. There was fussing about whether he had appointed a successor or not. All those kinds of issues were the same. And in fact, this is not just these 2 churches. This has happened a lot in religious movements. Anytime you have a charismatic founder of a religious movement, if you want the thing to survive, the first thing you should do is appoint a successor, clearly and vocally and overtly, so everybody doesn't fight about it and split the church afterwards. And that was the mistake both of these guys made. One faction of the Restoration felt that the prophet's son, Joseph Smith III, who, as you might recall at the time of Joseph's death, was a boy. He was, 9, 8? How old was he? In that neighborhood, anyway. But he had been designated the successor, similar to Shia Islam, who felt that they had designated the successor, who was a member of the family. you see. And that God chose the leader through the prophetic power of Joseph Jr. Another faction of Restoration felt that, like Sunni Islam, the prophet's closest companions, the Council of 12, were the legitimate successors, and Brigham Young was the president of the Council of 12. So he was the choice for them. So it's basically the same split we saw in our church, or the Restoration movement, that we saw in Islam, you know, what was that, 1,200 years earlier. And of course, those who accepted Brigham Young became the Mormon Church, and those that accepted Joseph Smith eventually became the Community of Christ.
95% of all the Restoration.
And that's one of my next points. So, in this analysis, the Community of Christ is more like Shia Islam. A family member was accepted as the successor after being identified by the prophet through a revelation from God. That's just like Shia does. That's exactly what we do. And Shia Islam, subsequent leaders were also members of the family. And like Shia, Community of Christ is demographically much smaller. And I don't know if this kind of a structure leads to smallerness. There's no such word. Being small or not, but that's what happened. And the LDS Mormon Church is like Sunni Islam, close companions of the prophet, the Quorum of 12, assume leadership, and that's still the procedure in the LDS Church, which is why every prophet or every president of the LDS Church, the Mormon Church, is very, very old, because they always take the senior apostle becomes the prophet. And it's always, the senior apostle is always a really old guy. So they're almost, I think the average age is like in the 80s when they take over or something like that. It's just really remarkable. And the LDS is by far and away the largest Restoration Church, by a very long margin. So there's some similarities there. Okay, let's take a look at our church and see how this all developed, this process that we have. Here's Joe, and an early revelation. This is Joe Jr. I gotta get this image out of my head now. I just had a flashback to a movie. An early revelation given on the day that the church was founded, April 6, 1830, said, "Behold, there shall be a record kept among you, and in it thou shalt be called a seer, a translator, a prophet of Jesus Christ." Okay? So less than a year later, section 43 fleshes that out. It says, "Verily, verily, I say to you that you have received a commandment for a law into my church." He was so verbose with his,
The King's English.
man, if one word was good, 5 would be better. That's how Joseph Smith did Revelations. But for a commandment unto my church through him whom I have appointed unto you to receive commandments and revelations from my hand. And this ye shall know assuredly, that there can be none other appointed unto you to receive commandments and revelations until he be taken, if he abides in me. So it means, but this established the principle that the prophet gets revelations and nobody else can. Because at this point they were having problems with everybody saying, "Oh, I had a revelation and we should, you know." And Joseph said, "No, this is chaos. We're going to have to rein that in."
Nobody will get it again until he takes it.
They'll be taken.
Until he dies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a,
Till he be taken, and that established the precedent that you serve until you die. Yeah. And then in 1834, section 99 says, "The president of the church, who is also the president of the council, is appointed by revelation and acknowledged in his administration by the voice of the church." So this emphasizes the common consent thing, which is an important part of our process. Okay? Okay. Section 113 is now in the appendix in the historical documents in the back, but adopted soon after the death of Joseph Smith. Basically is an account of the death of Joseph and Hiram. It's not a revelation, and it doesn't mention Joseph Smith III as a successor, which is the logical place where it should have referenced it if it was going to be referenced. And in fact, no section of the Doctrine and Covenants anywhere says anything about Joseph Smith III being prophet of the church. So he was accepted by one faction because of the strong belief that that's what Joseph wanted. Jr. wanted, was for Joseph III to be his successor. Joseph was only in his 30s when he died, right? I forgot, he was born in 1800, I can't remember now. He was in his late 30s, I think, when he died. So he assumed he was going to live 20 or 30 more years. Why wouldn't he assume that, you know? And that Joseph III would have been a grown man. I think he assumed he had plenty of time to do this. But anyway, the RLDS Church, when it reformed in 1860, ordained Joseph III as a president and prophet. And this established the tradition of lineal descent for the prophecy for the president that we've had in the RLDS Church. And that was an important point. As you probably know from your understanding of history, we were obsessed for 100 years or more with trying to prove to the world that we weren't the Mormons. And we pointed out constantly ways we were different than the Mormons. And one of those was the way they chose the leader of the church. You know, we had lineal succession. We had Smiths going to be our presidents and prophets. And the Mormon church had whichever apostle happened to be the oldest at the time. And we said that our way is superior. You know, it's better. It's not the Mormon way. And that was an important indication of who we were. Okay? So that was lineal succession was upheld in the Revelation, section 127, given through Joseph Smith III, designating his son, Frederick M. Smith, as his successor. And here's that document. It says, inasmuch as misunderstanding has occurred in regard to the meaning of a revelation hitherto given through my servant Joseph Smith, in regard to who should be called to preside in case my servant shall be taken away or fall by transgression, it is now declared that in case of the removal of my servant, now presiding over the church by death or transgression, my servant Frederick M. Smith, if he remain faithful and steadfast, should be chosen in accordance with the revelation which had been given, and so forth. So in other words, my son is going to be prophet. It also says he has to remain faithful, though. And if he has a problem, if he isn't faithful, then somebody else gets picked. But fortunately, Joseph Smith III had other sons. Frederick Smith did not name a successor in the Doctrine and Covenants, in the Revelation in the Doctrine and Covenants. He never got around to doing that. He did call his brother, Israel Smith, to the first presidency in 1940, though. And everybody was thinking, what is he saying here? First presidency is a stepping stone to the prophetic leadership. This is a Smith. This is his brother. You know, it seemed interesting. And when he died in 1946, Frederick Smith died in 1946, everybody knew the new prophet president was going to be a Smith. They just didn't know which one, because he never designated a successor. So there were 4 viable candidates at this point. Elbert Smith was a grandson of Joseph Smith Jr. and had served for a long time as a member of the first presidency and presiding patriarch. He was a legitimate and strong candidate. Israel Smith was a son of Joseph Smith III, brother to Fred Smith, who was also a member of the first presidency. So this was the first presidency with these 2 Smiths. W. Wallace Smith was another son of Joseph Smith III, who was a stepson or half-brother of these 2 guys, of Israel Smith and Fred Smith. But he was little known in the church at this point. They knew he was there, but he hadn't done much. He hadn't been ordained as an apostle yet, or anything like that. So, and finally, Frederick A. Smith, a nephew of Joseph Smith III, had been the presiding patriarch of the church for 25 years. That's a big deal job, which would legitimately qualify him to maybe come in. And as they went through this, you're going like, what do we do? There's no prophetic indication of a succession for the leadership. Who do we get? Who do we pick? These two guys, Elbert and Israel, were the top two candidates. They were the first presidency, so it made sense. And in order to, and how this worked out, we're not sure, because as Chris pointed out, the guidelines say if there is no prophet, the quorum of the apostles basically runs the church, So that's what the apostles were doing. But less than a month after the death, Albert Smith, the presiding patriarch of the church, presented a revelation of his own, calling Israel Smith to the prophetic leadership. Now, this is interesting because the two would be like Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And one of them said, I have a revelation from God that the other one should be president of the United States. It kind of clears the path, right? And that's what Albert did, which kept the church from devolving into a nasty civil war or fighting or infighting or whatever. So to his great credit, and he probably did have a legitimate revelation, but to his great credit, he did the right thing and cleared the path for Israel to take over. The Quorum of 12, who were technically leading the church at this point, also said, at this point, they hadn't said it before, but at this point they said Frederick M. Smith had designated his brother to be a successor. Just never had it written down. It was never acted on by World Conference, but they said that he had done this in the quorums. So World Conference was then in session, and this was affirmed by World Conference, and Israel Smith was immediately ordained as prophet, president, seer, revelator of the church. So this is the first time we had to figure out what to do if there was no, after Joseph Smith Jr. But once we had the RLDS church, this is the first time we had to figure this out. And it went relatively smoothly. Thanks mostly to Albert Smith, I think. I put a picture of Israel Smith in his baseball uniform just because I thought it was a cool picture. He was a fanatical baseball fan and used to take apostles to games at Kansas City to see the Kansas City Athletics play and all that kind of stuff, and was a pretty good player in his day. So I just thought I'd throw that in there. But Israel Smith, because of his experience coming to authority when there was a lack of a clear successor, made the succession to the church a real priority for him. And only 6 years afterwards, after he became prophet, he presented Section 144, which goes on and basically says that since we don't know when we're going to die, I'm appointing now William Wallace Smith, my brother, technically half brother, but that's okay, brother, will succeed in the high priesthood of the church. So we knew at that point that W. Wallace Smith was going to be the new president. Now, he had been little known at this point, but he'd been called to be an apostle a year after Israel Smith took over, and it was called to the first presidency 3 years later. So he had a pretty rapid ascension. And I think it's because Israel Smith, he testifies that at each of these callings, it became known to him he was going to be the president of the church. So I think he was fast-tracking his brother to make sure that he was going to be prepared, which actually makes sense. It's probably a good way to prepare somebody for this. So Israel Smith was killed in a car accident driving from Independence to Lamoni in June of 1958. And I mention this because it really shook the church up a lot. It was sudden, it was unexpected. Nobody expects a car wreck, And a lot of church members said, how come God didn't protect him? He was doing church business. Why did he, if you can help me remember, I was trying to remember in my own head, I think that the analysis was he just gone to sleep at the wheel and drifted off the road and hit. I've seen a picture of the car, and it would then a miracle in the order of the loaves of fishes, if anybody had survived. It was a mess. Hey, remember that? So a lot of people are wondering what's going on that God didn't protect his chosen prophet from a car wreck. Well, World Conference was 4 months off. So who was going to be in charge? Because World Conference had to act on W. Wallace Smith being appointed to be the prophet of the church. So W. Wallace Smith and F. Henry Edwards are the first presidency, the surviving members, and here they are. So for 4 months, they ran the church. And W. Wallace Smith's first revelation, given the day he was ordained at World Conference in October that year, said, I have taken myself unto myself my own. It was wisdom that my servant Israel Smith be released from his onerous duties. He has found his reward with the faithful. This was his attempt to try to mollify the church and settle the church down and saying that God had a plan for Israel, but it raises some, in my mind, some serious theological issues about the kind of God we worship. This is a God that's going to make Israel Smith have a horrible car wreck because he needed to have a rest. That seemed a little weird to me, but, I'm not a theologian on the level of these guys, so I'm not going to get into that. But this is his attempt to try to calm the church down and help the church realize that God has a plan. I also wanted to mention, well, we've got F. Henry Edwards up here, that the idea of lineal succession has one problem. You ignore a lot of really, really talented people who aren't Smiths. And of all the people in our church history who were really talented, the title of most talented person who was never church president goes to F. Henry Edwards. He was enormously gifted and basically ran the church for decades as a member of the first presidency. And if it was now, he might be a strong candidate for being the president of the church. So W. L. Smith retired as church president in 1978. What? He didn't serve till he died? This also shook some people up. You can't retire. You can't quit. There's only one way out. But he was 78 at the time. He lived to be 89. So, he could have served on. But he presented this revelation. And this was a kind of a dicey time. Dicey time because in 1976, he had already made plans to retire in 78. And so he presented a revelation that said, in order that my church shall continue to be led by my spirit through the heritage of its founder. So he's saying we have to have lineal descent. And the only person standing out there is my son, Wally B. Smith. That's the only option at this point. And but he was an elder at the church, but had not served in the authority positions or anything like that. So the revelation in 1976 said, okay, Wallace B. Smith is going to be called to be prophet president designate and is coming immediately into the quorum of the first presidency. And we're going to get this boy some experience, basically, and I'm going to mentor him for 2 years. And then in 1978, he'll take over. Okay. Now, again, this is not a bad model to do. It's not a bad way to go. But this is how important lineal descent was, that he felt like he had to do something like this. So he was a great-grandson, by the way, of Joseph Smith, Jr.
I just want to point out, if you're keeping track, that Joseph Smith III had 3 sons.
Yes, 3 sons.
When he passed away in 1914, his 3 sons were leaders of the church in
Yep.
Let that sink in.
Actually, I'm glad you made that point. I hadn't thought to make that point, but it's a good one.
That it was Joseph Smith III was the dad, and then well, not each, but
Each son in turn.
each son in turn,
Yeah.
because of how long he lived and how he had three successive, not at the same time, but successive wives. His last wife was the mother of W. Wallace.
W. Wallace.
Because he was so young, W. Wallace was actually pretty young.
Yeah. He was young when his father died.
He was young when his father died.
Yeah.
So when you think about it, up until Wally B, it was grandchildren of Joseph Smith the Jr.
Yeah, who were running the church.
who were running the church.
Until
1970.
after I had joined the church.
Grandchildren.
You know,
We're not talking
so-
like, great-grandchildren and generations. No,
It's like the relationship of Jordan to Carol.
yeah.
That relationship. And that's an interesting point to make.
It really, there is a series of Project Science podcasts on the history of the church that talks about a lot of this stuff. But it really jumped out to me that we're not talking successive generations, we're talking a father to his son, a brother to his brother.
And it's a really good point. And in case you thought I was trying to belittle Wally B. Smith's abilities, he was turned out to be an outstanding president prophet of the church. He really was. And I wanted to point that out. It was him that, with the revelation that allowed Judy to be ordained and other women to be ordained. I just had this picture. He also got the temple going. He was the first person to suggest renaming the church to Community of Christ. I mean, he did a lot of really great stuff. So I have a lot of respect for Wallace B. Smith. So I'm not trying to downgrade him at all. But I remember this clearly because I was an adult at this point. There was all kinds of speculation because he had no sons and 3 daughters. If he was a true prophet of God, how come God couldn't give him a son? And did he cause the ordination of women to happen just so one of his daughters could take over as the church president? I heard this a lot. And so there was a lot of talk about whether an appropriate Smith could be found as a successor. And there were a few shirt-tail relatives way back there that they kept saying, maybe this guy. But it was a dicey time again for the succession. And again, one of the great things Wally B. Smith did was he said, okay, enough of this nonsense. He just came right out and said, this is how we're going to do it. I'm going to call Grant McMurray to be the president of the church. And if you don't like it, the restoration branches are right across the street. That's okay. But this is what we're going to do. Grant McMurray is a member of the First Presidency. He's a talented guy. He's going to be the next prophet. And he did that relatively early so that there would be less of this speculation and rumor. Okay? Yeah. It was a hard thing for me too as a adult convert. I was going like, this doesn't even make sense. I had the same reaction to a monarchy. Just because the king has a son, that son's supposed to be the best person in the entire country to run the country? Didn't have to be as, I was like, I had some trouble with that too. It was an issue for me. Yeah.
Hadn't been in the church very long, but I just was like, that's just weird.
It's just weird.
So this made a lot of sense. This happened shortly after I joined. So
Yeah, I was fine with this. In fact, I interviewed Grant McMurray for my dissertation, and I found him to be quite enjoyable to talk to and knowledgeable. And I thought this guy could easily be president of the church, However, as you all know, he resigned abruptly, citing some inappropriate choices and circumstances in my life because I cannot continue to effectively be the president of the church, and there was no successor. So again, we have no successor. So the First Presidency and the Apostolic Quorum together kind of ran the church. Joe Accessor to be identified. The Joint Council of Church Leaders, led by the Council of 12, announced, and this would have been almost a year later, Steve Veazey to be the president prophet of the church. And they said that this was after a spirit of discernment that they had gone through. Was there a formal revelation for Steve? I don't think so. So this might be the first time in our church history we didn't have a formal revelation for the prophet of the church. But again, I'm not picking on it. I think Steve Veazey's been an amazingly good church president. I think it was a very wise choice. I really do. As you know, he, citing poor health, has announced that he was resigning at the World Conference this year, and he appointed Stacey Cram to be the prophet designate. She was already a member of the First Presidency. She had tons of experience. She'd been an apostle and so forth. And so at the World Conference this year, we have to approve her. If we do, of course, she'll be the first woman to be the prophet of the church, president of the church.
I'm going to correct you on that.
Please do.
Stacey was chosen by the Council of 12. And the reason why I know that is she was on a Project 9 podcast that I literally edited yesterday. From her own words, she shared the way that she was chosen. The Council of 12 went out and discerned it and presented.
I thought Steve Veazey had nothing to do with it.
No.
Well, then correct that. I missed that.
And so
I missed that.
There was a call after the Council of 12 did their discernment. They were going to call Stacey and Scott to let them know what the choice was.
Yeah, because between those two.
Well, they didn't say who was going to be between.
Well, but those are the two candidates.
They wanted,
They were open, they opened the field, you could.
any of the Council of 12 could have also done it. That's
Yeah.
the way that
Yeah.
Stacey got it. But they were wanting to make sure that the first presidency was informed of it. So they were going to call Stacey and Scott, and they had an agreement that they were going to do it at the same time, because if they called one and not the other, but
Right.
that's when they let Stacey know that she was called, and Scott gave a testimony in favor of that as well.
So you did the Albert Smith thing.
Yes.
Good for him.
So, but she was chosen by the Council of 12.
Okay, well, thank you for that correction. I did not remember that. So I appreciate that correction. I should, before this, I can correct this before we put it online if you want.
It's fine. It's corrected in the record of the report.
Okay, okay. Okay, so that's our church. And that's what is going to be so historic about the 2025 World Conference. Well, see, this if that's the case, this is the first time the prophet has not been, well.
Well, so here's the thing, the last two times.
The last two times been,
Yeah.
last two times been the Council of 12.
Not the oldest member, but
Right.
the Council of 12 discerned it.
Yeah, yeah.
I think
But
that's-
Steve was the head of the Council of 12 too.
It just happened.
He happened to be, but she wasn't. So she was first president in the first presidency. So yeah, it could be. That's the way we're going with this. I don't know. Interesting.
But Matt, right, how, yeah.
So I also, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but the difference between us and the Mormon church, right, is the Mormon church was the oldest member of the Council of 12.
No, it's the head of the Council of 12. But that was a seniority position. So it was almost always the oldest.
That tradition has made their change a lot slower.
Absolutely.
It's always a very, very old person that becomes the leader of the church. Whereas with our lineal succession, it went from a very, very old person, Joseph Smith III, to his son, but then because of the way that Joseph Smith III had sons, they were always a lot younger.
Yeah.
And And I think that enabled our church to become more progressive than the Mormon church, because the old wasn't in charge. You had some very young folks that made some very challenging decisions. But because they were younger, they were more in tune with progress.
That could be. Okay, so it's 11:30, and we're about to start the Roman Catholic Church. So maybe we'll just wait on that.
I think we should wait on that.
Part two next time.
Well, it's only about 10 minutes to go. So, because there's not much left here, but we don't have time to do the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox. I'm going to laser you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll call it quits here, and we'll see. Yeah.
I remember actually when I was in seminary, I wrote a paper on comparison between, and Islam.
You should have been doing this talk. You know more about it than I do.
Well, no, you did a lot, yeah. I did, but I wasn't written here, well, sure. But yeah, I totally was, so it's kind of a nice affirmation because you also say
Oh,
that.
yeah.
I was like, I'm totally, as I'm learning about Islam, I'm like, this is like, there's a lot of comparison.
There is a lot of comparison.